They said it couldn't happen, that no loving parent could be erased from their child's life. But here you are, and you're not alone. Welcome to iWasErased Reflections, a podcast for parents, for grandparents, and our children who are living through the trauma of parental alienation and or abduction. I'm David Shubert, an advocate, a parent, and a survivor who's lived this nightmare firsthand in living color. Each episode begins with a reflection. Sometimes it's a rant. Sometimes it's a wake-up call, and then we unpack it together. No fluff, just honest, real talk about alienation, court failures, and the emotional wreckage it leaves behind. This isn't therapy. It's not legal advice. Instead, it's truth. It's pain. And it's hard-earned hope that lives inside us all. That's why these conversations matter. In this first episode of iWasErased Reflections, I open up about why I started this podcast and why I believe staying silent is no longer an option. I talk about my own experiences as both a left behind and alienated parent, and how they've shaped not just what I write, but how I live my life today. The isolation, the disbelief, and the long fight for truth. All of it led me right here. Now, this isn't about reliving old pain. Instead, it's about giving it purpose. It's the beginning of something I wish had existed when I first felt erased. Because when your voice is taken, reclaiming it becomes the first step towards healing. And that's why I'm here. So I hope you'll be able to connect with these reflections as we continue forward with today's show. You know, each and every day, all around the world, millions of innocent parents and their children get caught up in the grip of alienation. Now, we're not talking about just hundreds here, or even thousands. Instead, we're talking about untold millions. Just think about that for a moment. Untold millions. And it's all because of one parent. One parent who decides to erase the other. Sometimes it's out of anger. Sometimes it's out of retaliation. Other times it's just their way of trying to regain control they lost over their former partner. And while the child is often the one left to carry the aftermath, it's the erased parent and increasingly even the erased grandparent who wakes up every day inside that silence. That's the sad reality we're naming here today. That's the silence we're going to be breaking. But first, and before we go any further, I want to take a quick moment to thank you for being here, because naming this truth takes courage, and listening to it takes heart. Now, with that said, welcome to the first episode of iWasErased Reflections. My name is David Shubert, and I know this journey firsthand. You see, I've lived that pain. I've lived that silence, and I've lived those courtrooms. I've also fought to stay in my kids' lives. That's why I started iWasErased. To turn isolation into connection and pain into purpose. So whether you're an alienated or left behind parent, this place is meant for you. Each week, I'll be sharing one of my reflections based on real experiences and honest thoughts. Each one comes from my own lived experiences, and you'll hear it with my own voice. And then we're going to sit with it. Just one alienated parent sharing what they went through with another parent who knows that same trauma and that same heartache. But keep in mind, this is more than just a podcast. It's a place to find the words for what you've been living. It's a place where silence finally gets a voice. And that's where my reflections come in. They're not therapy. They're not prescriptions. They're just me telling the truth as I've lived it, because sometimes just hearing someone else say it out loud is often the first step towards healing. Now, many of you already know me from my reflections that I've shared over the years through social media, newsletters, and in my books. But now, for the first time, you'll hear those words spoken out loud, the way they were actually meant to be, with real emotion and real heart. But before we dive into the core of this podcast, however, I'd like to take you back to the very beginning, to the moment where everything changed for me. And just to let you know, I'm not doing this to dwell on the past. It's so that you know I'm not just another voice behind the mic. I'm actually a parent who's lived this nightmare. The courts, the quiet, and even the emotional pain. You see, understanding where it all started will hopefully show you why these words aren't just talking points for a show. Instead, they're my lived truth. And it's through my lens that I'm going to bring them to you. Now, later on, and in a future episode, though, I'll share more of my own personal story. But for now, I'm just going to give you a quick snapshot of all this. Now, my journey actually began nearly 25 years ago, way back in January 2001. And I remember at the time, none of it looked like a warning. It was only later did the signs actually come into focus. Now, that said, I remember when all of this really kicked off for me. It was the year the Twin Towers in New York City were brought down by the evildoers. They came crashing down into a tangled heap of wreckage. And I suppose, in a strange kind of way, that moment actually mirrored what was about to happen in my own life. The destruction, the disbelief, the sudden collapse of something I thought was solid. Now, just as the world was grappling with its own sense of devastation, I too was about to face my own. I just didn't know it yet. But while the world was inching towards its own breaking point, I had already stepped into mine. And everything I thought was stable was quietly beginning to unravel behind the scenes. Now, to fully understand what happened, I want you to visualize it. Every word, every moment as it plays out in your mind's eye. Okay, now picture this, if you will. At the time, I was still reeling from a recent business loss. You see, everything that I'd worked so hard for was suddenly gone. Not surprisingly, my head was out there in left field. I found myself hibernating from the world as I tried to figure out what to do next. And it was during those times that I escaped into my computer, avoiding the outside world completely. But eventually, I came up for air. I started going outside again, and I even reconnected with old friends. Still, something was missing. I was alone. In fact, I wasn't just alone. I was actually lonely, I guess. So that's when I decided to try online dating for the very first time ever. I figured at the time, what did I really have to lose in light of everything that I just went through? And while it's strange, but I remember that at first it was fun. But I never really found that right person. Until one day, a message arrived in my inbox, believe it or not, from halfway around the world. You see, a woman had seen my profile. She wanted to know more about me. And needless to say, my interest was piqued. We connected fairly quickly, and before you knew it, there were daily phone calls and long conversations. And you know the kind I'm talking about, the kind that make you feel understood and valued. But I have to admit that at the time, my self-esteem wasn't exactly at its highest levels yet, considering how I was still feeling right after the loss of my business. Now, for the most part, I was still in a vulnerable state, I guess, is lack of a better term. And when you're in that place, it doesn't take much. a little warmth here, a few kind words over there, and suddenly you actually start to believe maybe, just maybe, you're worth something after all. Now, she knew how to say all the right things. She made me feel needed. She made me feel special. She even made me smile again. Well, it's no stretch of the imagination, but my feelings for her, well, they took off rather quickly because of these things. And it didn't take long before I wanted to know more about her life behind the voice. I would learn that she was a widow with a toddler son living in a country that she had no real ties to. There was no family, no roots, no nothing to hold her there, because she was originally from somewhere else. So we wound up rushing things. Within about 6 months, she and her young son were on their way here, and into my home, and into my life. They arrived in June of that year, and with them came a new chapter I didn't yet know how to read. In reality, I suppose, I have to admit that everything happened really fast. But you have to understand that when you're hurting and someone shows up with warmth and possibility, fast can often feel like the only speed that makes sense. Now, I remember that first year went by fairly well as a new couple. But afterward, there came the subtle shifts, starting right around the time she received her permanent residency card. I remember asking her one day if she'd help with the monthly expenses since she was now working. Her response was quick and it was sharp, and I still remember quite vividly what she said. If my son and I weren't living with you, you'd still have the same bills, so you can keep on paying for them yourself. Well, needless to say, at the time, I was definitely floored by her answer because it wasn't anything that I'd ever expected. From there, the mask began to slip, slowly, steadily, and from that point on, things only got worse. Now, in an effort to speed things up a little bit, let's fast forward all this to 3.5 years later, because this is when we welcomed a baby girl into our home. She was my firstborn. I was totally ecstatic and walking on clouds at the very thought of having my first child. It should have brought us closer. Instead, our home became a battlefield. In those days, I found myself constantly walking on eggshells, tiptoeing through a minefield of triggers. The daily fights, the mood swings, they wore me down. And I knew they were hurting the kids too. So I started looking for a new place to live, but keep in mind that while I was doing this, we were still under the same roof. However, before I was able to move out, there came a day that would change my life forever. It was June 7th, 2007, a date forever etched into my mind. That was the day that she abducted my children and took them overseas. That was also the day I was granted the title of left behind parent. My heart dropped when I learned this had happened. I entered a place that no one should ever have to go. It was a place that was so dark, light doesn't ever reach it. A place where 100 different emotions tend to hit you all at one time, and there's nothing you can even do to stop him. I remember that for the first 2 weeks afterwards, I couldn't function. I lost all appetite. I couldn't focus. I couldn't even sleep, and when I did, it was fragmented. I sank into a bottle of alcohol trying to numb the pain away. And every day I wandered my neighborhood. I'd go up one street and down the next, hoping that somehow, some way, they'd jump out of the bushes with these great big smiles and hollering that I'd found him, that it was only a game of hide and seek. But it wasn't a game. And I never found him. A few months later, I learned that as a parent, I had rights under the Hague Convention. With the help of NCMEC and the U.S. Department of State, I filed for their return. And what should have only taken about 3 or 4 months ended up dragging on until late spring of 2009. But in the end, my application for their return was successful. In June of that year, they returned to Colorado, exactly 2 years and almost to the day since the international abduction took place. By then, we were officially divorced, and now, with them back on U.S. soil, we could finally settle the matter of custody. Now, understandably, I was confident. In fact, I was overly confident that the kids would remain with me. After all, she's the one who abducted the children internationally. She's the one who ignored all visitation orders from the court. She's the one who even threatened violence. But judges in these cases? Well, let's just say it's always a crapshoot whether you can get a good one or a bad one. And in my case, I got a bad one. At the conclusion of a 3-day hearing, now the first one obviously was to confirm our attendance and nothing more. The second one was to present oral arguments and evidence, which, by the way, only lasted 2 hours. And then the final day to hear the ruling. The judge finally made his decision. Despite all the evidence, the ruling came down to one single aspect. The children had been gone for the previous 2 years, and the judge ruled it was in their best interest to remain with the mother and allowed them to return to the country from which they'd just been ordered to leave. That was the second time my heart dropped. I mentioned earlier how the abduction shattered me, but it was during this moment, standing in that courtroom, that was just as devastating. Because I knew deep down this would be the last time I would ever see or hear from my children ever again. And I was right. This would be the day I now officially entered the world of alienation. I remember thinking at the time and after the ruling that the judge was sending out a clear and compelling message to every abducting parent out there. Kidnap your children, take them to another country. If you get caught and you're lucky enough to get in my courtroom, I'm going to reward you. But that's another story for later on, I suppose. Now, not surprisingly, however, over the next 2 years, there were multiple contempt hearings over her refusal to allow court visitation, for which she failed to appear, by the way. Then, in June 2012, a modification hearing was scheduled. But again, she failed to attend. As a result, I was granted sole custody. The court also ordered her to return the children. She ignored that order as well. Now, because she'd failed to return the children to me in the U.S. as ordered, a couple of months later, the Arapahoe County District Attorney's Office here in Colorado issued a felony warrant for her arrest. International interference of parental responsibilities. Should have been easy in and easy out. But, much like the words best interest printed on my custody orders, the warrant the DA's office issued held no weight either. And here's the sad part. To this day, no one from the DA's office has ever lifted a finger to enforce it. No red notice, no extradition, no follow-up, just silence. They won't even return calls or emails. Now, just a quick side note to all this. In 2017, the felony charges were upgraded to the next higher level. But in the end, it was all blow and no show from the DA's office. You see, a crime against children went unpunished. And justice? Well, it was never served to my children and I, who are the victims in all this. I guess that because my wounds weren't visible, they didn't count. Now, as the years passed, I turned my focus to others, toward helping those who walk in the same road. Then in 2015, I found myself in Panama, Central America. And by the summer of 2016, while still living there, the seed for our iWasErased was planted. It started on Facebook under the name Hopeful Father, which, by the way, is still active to this day. Now, from that small beginning, it grew. And so did I. Week by week, I shared my written reflections. They gained momentum on social media, Substack, LinkedIn, and in a few self-published books. Each one is a piece of my story, and each one is a lifeline for someone else. You now know the road that led me here and to you. Because with each piece I shared, it became more and more clear. This wasn't just my story. Instead, it was ours. That's when I knew it needed more than simple words on a page. It needed a voice. It needed its own platform. It needed this. This show is for the parent who's been pushed to the sidelines. It's for the grandparent who's quietly vanished from the birthdays and the school plays, and for the child who was asked to carry more than they could ever understand. It's also for the left-behind parent who wakes up every morning to the silence that should never exist. Now, if that's you, you don't need to explain yourself. After all, I've been there. I've lived it. I've even named it, and I know exactly how heavy it can feel, especially in those quiet moments when the rest of the world keeps moving and you're just trying to hold it together. Well, here's what you can expect from me. Each week, I'm going to share one of my reflections, spoken in my own voice, just like this. And then I'll set it down, and we'll unpack it. We'll unpack it to where it meets real life, how it shows up, and what to notice, and why it even matters. There's no expert opinions here, no instructions, just straight talk. And one small step you can actually carry with you before the day ends. You see, that's the rhythm we're going to build together. Some weeks, maybe it'll be a line you can actually lean on when the silence gets too loud. Other weeks, it may be a simple way to hold on to a set boundary or steady yourself when the room feels too heavy. We're going to name these realities for what they really are. No sugarcoating, no sidestepping, none of that. But remember, we're not sprinting here. Instead, we're building something you can come back to again and again and at your own pace. And when things do finally start to get better for you, just keep in mind that it's usually a slow process. It's the little repeatable choices. One honest message to your child here. One kept promise there. And one calm boundary you held. These are the things that add up over time. No one can rush it. No one else can even write it for you. And little by little, we're going to move from isolation to connection and from pain to purpose. Now, I wanted this first episode to be more than just an introduction, to show you who I am and why these words matter beyond the page or the screen. By opening up about my own personal journey as a left behind and alienated parent, I'm giving voice to something personal. I know I'm not alone. This is just the beginning. I hope you'll join me next time as I start sharing my reflections through the same lens. So if you're watching this on YouTube, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, follow the show. If you can, leave a quick rating or a review. And if someone you know needs the language, share an episode. Who knows? You might be the bridge that they've been waiting for. Now, as we wrap up this first episode, I hope you found something here that resonates. And I want to thank you for spending the time with me today and letting me set the stage for what we're building together. Remember, you're not alone. There are many of us willing to be your shoulder to lean on during difficult times, an ear to listen, and a quiet understanding of what you're going through. So until their eyes find yours again, stay steady and stay strong.